you've obviously seen this before, right?
Yes, I've seen it probably a dozen times over the years or so. I saw it back in, I think 1985 was the first time I saw it. It was one of the first movies I ever rented and copied, actually.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, what's interesting about this is that we the last movie we did, The Sadist, was a drive-in movie, and it was made during the heart of the drive-in era in the 60s, mid 60s. And this is that very next era of low-budget filmmaking, Grindhouse.
Hmm.
Um, Grindhouse kind of took up where the drive-in left off, and then obviously after that you'd have home video, which would kill both markets completely. But um, but yeah, it was interesting because with the drive-in movies, you had they usually promised a lot of like salacious things, but didn't really deliver because of the era and the censorship and the things going on culturally. But by the time you get to the 70s, like all types of filmmaking from mainstream Hollywood, with the Hollywood New Wave, and a lot of directors that become famous like still today, Scorsese and Spielberg, all those filmmakers came up and had a lot of creative freedom. And yeah, with the censorship laws relaxed, like movies like this really kind of flourished in that grindhouse era. With more sleaze and sex and all that salacious stuff. Even though, with the reputation this has, it's not very graphic in any way.
No, and I can tell you, this is a movie that I heard about for years before I actually saw the movie. You know, I remember before VCRs and everything, and when there was just no way to see something like this, I was aware of it. And so I had it built up in my, 10-year-old head that this was some sort of gory masterpiece. And when I saw it originally, I think I was a freshman in high school. I think I was actually a little bit disappointed, to be honest with you, because I was expecting some giant gore fest, and it's obviously not that. Now I can tell you, this film has grown on me over the years. I've learned to appreciate it, and I understand it now, and I do think it's a very good film. But my initial reaction, because it'd been so built up in my mind, was a little disappointment because I was looking for gore, and it doesn't have a ton of that.
It's funny, like I had the opposite reaction. Like the when I liked it most was the first time I saw it. Because me and a couple of my buddies, we got some beers and we were hanging out. We went to a video store, which was like a block from my friend's house, and we picked this up and we watched it. And it was one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. On first viewing, it kind of like tapered off as I've watched it more. But for me, I think what clicks with me is with future generations, movie like the Blair Witch Project and things like that, is the is like the documentary feel to it, gives it a sense of realism, and also the fact that the kills aren't very cinematic. To me, like the for like when I watched it again today for the show, I rewound every kill.
Oh, yeah, here's something. Stop. Stop.
Because it just comes, like, it's coming, but it just happens so quickly. It's like, oh,
Yes.
let me every kill I just rewound because I had to watch it again. And I think what clicked with me so much the first time I saw it is we were watching it at my friend's house. We were all drinking, hanging out, lights are out, and we're not rewinding it. We're just watching it straight. So those kills kind of just like stay with you, and your mind builds it up so much. But when you can rewind it and watch it again, it kind of loses a little bit. But in that first viewing where it's just like, oh shit, that's how it happens. That's how they die. Like, it kind of like throws you off guard a little bit.
What gets
Um,
me about this film is the big thing is just the atmosphere. Something about the atmosphere, you can just tell by watching it that it's quiet and hot. I've been in Texas. I know what that Texas heat feels like. I can just feel the heat coming through this film, the uncomfortableness and that warm house. I can just feel as soon as you walk in there, it's like an oven. I get it. And it's just that gritty atmosphere, I think, more than anything in this movie. Like I said, there's not a lot of blood. There's not a whole lot of killing. What do we have? 4 or 5 deaths. But there is just that overall, just gritty atmosphere. And the fact that there's not really a soundtrack in this movie. In fact, I read that other than a little bit of some music they use at the beginning, the rest of the sounds in the movie are just sounds of slaughterhouse sounds, banging and this and that. There's no actual music going on in this movie. It's just quiet, except for these bangs you hear here and there. So
Yeah, they were like sound effects,
yeah,
but not really like music or a score.
correct, correct.
This the sound effects just kind of like heightened it a little bit, but it was very subtle. But yeah, I interviewed John Dugan, who played the old man, the grandfather in the film, and he was actually one of the youngest people in the cast, but it was just under all that makeup. And he spoke about the heat. He was like, people were just wearing like cutoffs and Daisy Dukes, and people
Hmm.
were sweating. It was just an incredibly hot summer. He said it took him a little over a month to shoot the film, but the heat was the thing that really killed them, because even when they were indoors, it was even worse, because then you had the lights, because you're talking about film lights,
Sure.
which are worse, and then day for night they have to block out the sun, and then it gets real like stuffy with the
Yep.
interior scenes, and he had to wear all that liquid latex makeup on his face to make him look older, and he was just like, he was like, oh, he almost passed out a few times. They also had the '70s thing where, whether it was Grindhouse or the TV movie of the week, where everything is based on a true story, ripped from the headlines type thing. Do you think? I mean, I have my very strong opinions of this, but I think as time passes, people think generations before them were more naive. Do you actually think people thought this was based on a true story, or?
I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, I can tell you that before I saw this film, a friend of mine who's my same age, he told me that once he learned about this film, he went to the library and looked up newspapers to try to find anything about this that happened. And then he's the one who actually told me it is not real. It did not happen. But I can believe it. I can believe that people believed it at the time. There was no internet. There wasn't as much going on that you could find this information out. I could see it happening. I can't see it happening today, but yeah, 40 years ago, yeah, I could see it. 45 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of have a different approach. I think like it's kind of like Blair Witch, or what was that low budget movie that came out after Blair Witch, the found footage one that became real popular, where it was just
I'm
like the
not.
couple in the house.
Oh, is it Paranormal Activity?
Paranormal Activity. I think it's like Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity, whereas a small section of people actually believe it, but the masses are just like, it's just a marketing gimmick. But as time passes, like, we look at it with rose-colored glasses and say, "Oh yeah, everybody thought it was real." I don't know,
Hmm.
but yeah, I thought it was pretty good. This is considered one of the scariest movies ever made. Now, having seen it several times, and I know you said this year alone you've seen hundreds of movies, so I'm sure you've seen your share. Where would you rank this on your list of like scariest horror movies?
um, I don't honestly know. I mean, for me personally, to, I don't get scared anymore. I wish I would, because I would love to have that feeling. There's only really two movies that scare me, and this is not one of them. To me, it's just another horror movie. I could see where some people would be, but I'm just kind of desensitized after all the horror I've seen, that it just doesn't get to me anymore in terms of actual frightening stuff. A couple of movies do, but not this one.
Mhm. And how would you categorize this? Because it's kind of interesting. This came out well after Psycho, but then well before Halloween and
Mhm.
Friday the 13th. It does have certain tropes that follow the slasher motifs. It's where it's like you have the last
Yep.
girl, you have the everyone dying off very quickly, but when it comes to the main character, suddenly she has like, this invisible like shield around her, where they push her around instead of just killing her.
I think what separates it a little bit from a typical slasher film as we know it from Halloween and on through the early 80s, um, most of those slasher films had one killer, just one guy with a machete or whatever. This movie had an entire family. And with the exception, I think, of the hitchhiker, everybody lived in that family. So um, usually in a horror movie, you know, the killer is the last one to die, and the one girl ends up living. But in this case, all the killers lived, with the exception of one, and that's different than a normal slasher.
Definitely. Yeah, like like I'm trying to think. It's definitely horror, but is it kind of more exploitation? Do you consider grindhouse a genre? It's kind of tricky to like pigeonhole it completely.
I think you could probably label it grindhouse. There's no nudity in this movie at all, but it's dark and dirty.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the main thing I took away from it. Like you said, it's the feel. You feel like dirty watching
Hmm.
this movie.
Yeah,
Not dirty in a sleazy way, but like you feel like, like the heat and with the shots of like the cutaways of like all the like, the skulls and all the different things. Like it pulls you into the atmosphere of the movie.
Informant led officers of the Muerto County Sheriff's Department to a cemetery just outside the small rural Texas community of Newt early this morning. Officers there discovered what appeared to be a grisly work of art, the remains of a badly decomposed body wired to a large monument.
And I think
yeah.
that's the strongest asset it has. And ironically, it being low budget, actually, I think helped it to to uh, to resonate more with people afterwards after they've seen it.
Yeah, was this Toby Hooper's first movie? I didn't even look
I
that up.
think they said he did one other movie before this, and this was his second, but it wasn't
Okay.
like a big movie or anything like that. So, what do you think of this as a horror franchise? When you put it
Hmm.
in with like the others, like Friday the 13th, Halloween, like where does this rank? Hellraiser, all those different franchises. Do you think it holds up, or is it just like the first one's pretty good and then it just kind of?
That's my opinion. I know there's a lot of horror fans that love part two. I never did care for it much, and I have seen a couple years ago. I watched all of them, and with the exception of the new one that came out in the theaters about maybe 2 years ago, I'm not sure. But prior to that, I'd seen them all, maybe about 4 years ago, and really the only one I really liked was the first one. I didn't care for two. As a franchise, I don't care a whole lot about it. I would prefer Friday the 13th or Halloween. However, that being said, I do think this particular film might outshine all of the other franchise best film altogether. This might be better than any Friday the 13th or Halloween movie, but as franchises go, I just prefer the other ones.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's just me.
So no, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's just me. Like I said, I know there's a lot of horror fans who disagree, especially with part two, but I just never got into part two, didn't care for it much.
Yeah, it seemed like they really went for the comedy with part two.
Yeah, it was a little over the top to me and just not believable. Whereas this film here is conceivably believable. Part two was crazy. You know, there was underground caverns and things, and it just didn't seem plausible to me. This one seemed like this could actually happen, and I
Mhm.
guess that in and of itself is a frightening aspect.
Yeah. When I spoke to John, he actually mentioned the other film he was in after this in the franchise was the one with Renee Zellweger and Matthew
Mhm.
McConaughey.
Yep,
And he said at the time I interviewed him, which was 2014, he said he never watched it even though he was in it, which was I thought was kind of weird. Actors usually love seeing themselves,
sure.
but yeah, I guess like even the people in it didn't really have a passion for it at a certain point. It's just a matter of like keeping the franchise going. Now, what did you think of the remake? The one I think it came out maybe like 2013 or so. I think that was the one with I'm trying to think of
Was
the
that one
actor.
just called Texas Chainsaw?
I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I know I saw it, but I couldn't tell you anything about it. I don't remember it. I saw it just the one time. I think I reviewed it on my old channel, and that was it.
Okay. I think that pretty much says it all. The fact that you
Yeah,
don't remember even watching it. So
yeah.
okay. So any final thoughts on this movie or
Again, I think this is a classic. This is one I try to revisit every couple of years. It's got some nostalgia memories for me too, as being one of, like I said, one of the very first movies that I ever rented. I should say rented and copied. I think this is probably in my top five or first five, I should say. But again, I really dig the atmosphere of this movie. It's just, like I said, dark and gritty, and it puts you right there. Um, it's a very quick film too, only 83 minutes long, so you can breeze through it very fast. And even the characters are. I like the hitchhiker character. He's crazy.
Hey, man, what up? What are you doing? Man, what are you
Um, Even Franklin, the guy on the wheelchair. I knew a guy in the 80s who was uh, 25 years older than me, but he had cerebral palsy. He was in a wheelchair, and he was a friend of mine, and his mannerisms and everything reminded me of Franklin in the movie. So I get nostalgic that way too. Seeing it's almost like seeing somebody I kind of knew.
I mean, they'd start squealing and freaking out and everything, and then have to come up and bash them 2 or 3 times. And then sometimes it wouldn't kill them. I mean, they'd skin them sometimes even before they were even
Oh,
dead.
that's horrible.
Yeah.
People shouldn't kill animals for food.
Oh, well, they don't do it like that anymore. Now they got this big air gun that shoots a bolt into their skull and then retracts it. It's just boom, goes boom, and then
Franklin, I like meat. Please change the subject. Get out of that.
Yeah, John was saying like Paul Partain, he stayed in character for the whole movie. And he would just like say, "Hey, get me a Coke," and just like, "You're not really in a wheelchair. Get up and get it yourself." So he was pissing them off during the whole shoot, which is he looked back at it fondly, but it seemed like he was really pissed off at him. But yeah, a lot of those guys, a lot of those people in the cast are dead now. You when you really think back about it, this movie was made a long time ago. Um, and
Marilyn Burns is gone. I know.
yeah, yeah, a lot of them passed, and one of them was actually killed by a guy who escaped from an asylum asylum. Either that's what John was telling me. Like they accidentally let him out. Online, they're saying he was just released from prison, but he was off his medication, and he killed one of the crew members from the movie with an axe on his front lawn.
That sounds
So
like a horror movie in and of
I
itself.
know, I know. When he told me, he was like, he was barely like holding it together because it really shook him. But yeah, I was just like, Jesus, like that sounds like, you
Yeah,
know,
I've got movies like that. I've seen them.
yeah, yeah, it sounds worse than what actually happened
Mhm.
in the movie. So, but yeah, they mainly like with movies like this, they have a following. They have people like you and myself who will revisit it and rewatch it. And a lot of these guys, they just keep making money just doing the convention circuit.
Right.
Because no one in this movie really, aside from the director, really had much of a career after this.
Correct.
They
Correct.
just basically just were able to sustain a career from this alone. Lou Perryman was the cast member the crew member that was
Ah,
killed. So, all right, so yeah, another one down the books, and yeah, definitely thumbs up from both of us. Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
absolutely.
check it out.
Absolutely.
Hello?